Hi guys, this will be a recording for Hack School Zero for those who couldn't make it. This workshop will go over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are important parts of web development, which is what you guys will be doing in the rest of Hack School to practice the MERN stack and eventually build your own full stack project. So here's the check-in code. You guys probably can't check in since this is just a recording, but in during the beginning of every workshop, we'll give you guys a check-in code and you guys can get points in the ACM portal. So this is an icebreaker. We'll also have icebreakers in the beginning of every workshop for you guys to make friends and talk to the people next to you. So just a quick introduction about Hack School. So this workshop is just a pre-workshop, as I said before, for Hack School. And Hack School will be running from week 3 into a couple weeks after that. And then eventually at the end, you guys will be able to deploy your own full stack web app. So who are we? We are the hack community of ACM, and we focus on hosting software workshops such as this one and the week-long hack school program to help people learn new skills and explore different parts of software development. We also host different workshops such as scalability, system design, front end, and back end development workshops. So here's the hack school timeline in week 1, which is this workshop, which already happened. We'll be going over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then the following weeks, you can see on the schedule, we'll be going over React next, MongoDB, Express.js, and then how to deploy. So firstly, introducing our project. So this is our project, which is a poll sharing app where you can create a poll. For example, cookies or cake, then description, owner, and the options. So you're creating a poll asking if you like cookies or cake. And then you can submit to create that poll. Looks like we have to have a description, so it's save dessert. So you submit that, and then you might not see this in the recording, but there's a notification saying poll created. Then you can see over here, our poll is created. You can click onto that and then vote. And then there will be a notification saying vote cast. Then we can see this vote shown on the screen. So this is just like a small, simple web app you guys can make and share with your friends and get their opinions on random polls like this. So this is what you guys will be making in the week-long series during Hack School. And then this is a web app that utilizes React, Next, MongoDB, like I mentioned in the previous slide. So this is the GitHub for this workshop. You guys can click into this and fork the repo to get the necessary files needed to do the activities in this workshop. And then here are the slides so you guys can follow along. So just a quick introduction into web development. So here, when people think of web development, you can separate into this Venn diagram showing web design and front-end development. So web design will be more like, what do you want the button to look like? What color scheme do you want the website to be like? What layout? For example, I want the images all on the right with descriptions on the left. So planning this layout is part of web design. And then front-end development, the other part would be creating the interface using programming, using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And front-end development is where you actually make the website usable. So the user can click this button and then it goes to another web page or some other functionality. So this is where you'll all code the exact elements of your web page and also style it. So this is where you implement your web design. And all of this comes together to be front end. So a quick background on on what actually happens when you visit your browser. So when you visit your browser, for example, Google, you're wondering, how do I get back all these results? So basically, your browser will send a request to the web server, for example, the Google web servers, which will send their request to their own databases to pull in all the data that you requested. And then these arrows will actually go back to your browser and show you the information that you requested. So the web server and the database, how we're getting that information, will be considered the back end. And then this all works together to let you use the browser or any website application. So now we'll be going into HTML, which is Hypertext Markup Language, which is the main building blocks of web development. So a quick showcase of the anatomy of an HTML element. So HTML is made up of these tags that you can see over here. You can see here each block would be a HTML element, and it is enclosed by a opening and closing tag. And then the letter after these brackets would classify which kind of tag it is. So here it is a paragraph tag. And then within the first set of brackets, you can see a attribute value pair, which is kind of labeling the element so it can put style onto them. So here we're using a class attribute, and then we're naming the class title because this is our title. And then we're putting the content we want in between the brackets, which is welcome to Hack School. So you'll see a lot of these blocks within your HTML, and then these will come together to create your website. So here's a mini activity. Go to this website, which is our Hack website, where you can see a lot of resources. For example, if you click into Hack School, there's week 0, week 1, and there's a lot of extra information and guidelines for you guys to follow as you make your website, or just get a quick introduction into web development. So the activity is for you to use the inspect element and update the HTML code to change the text on your website. So you guys can pause to do that, but here I'm just going to do inspect. And then here you can see the HTML of this web page. And as I go through each line, you can see which block on the website it's represented by. So here, you can click into the About section and keep opening these divs. Here you can say, welcome to Hack. Then you can write, I love web dev. And you can actually see this depicted on the website immediately. So that's a cool thing about the inspect element. You can play around with this on other websites and change it to see the connection between HTML and the actual browser that you look at. And now we're done with the first activity. And then we'll be going into HTML tags and containers. So an important part of HTML is using these divs that lets you separate and distinguish large parts of your website. So we actually call this a container because it contains multiple divs inside the outer div. So this is a good way to section off your web pages and put functionality onto large groups of HTML elements. So here you can see, for example, for our polls app, we would have our polls container, and then inside we would have two poll boxes. And then inside there, we have a H3 tag, which is just a text tag, labeling poll 1 and poll 2. So next we have a nav bar, which is a really common part of many websites, the navigation bar, where you can see different parts of the websites and it helps you navigate to different pages of the websites. So here you can see a large outer div, which with the ID of navbar. And then inside you have the title and the nav buttons. In this case, it's to add a poll and manage polls. Next, a quick quiz question to test you. What is the correct HTML element of the largest heading? So the answer is A, which is H1. And then that would be the largest heading you can get. I believe it goes up to H6, which is the smallest heading. And then outside of that, you can do paragraph tag or a different type of text. Here's another HTML element, which is forms. You can see the form in the first line here. And then inside the form, you have specific HTML elements for the form tag, which is label, input, and button. And the label will be for what you want the question to be, which is poll question. And then the input tag, which allows you to enter text. There's different attribute value pairs within it. You can see type, ID, name, and that it's required. And then the last one is a button, which is a submit button where you can use it to create the poll. So the first activity we'll do is to start on the project and create the nav bar. And then eventually after styling, the nav bar will look like this. So here are the instructions. You guys can follow along with each step after forking the repo that I showed you guys earlier. You guys can follow the instructions to do the first activity. So just to show what the result of the first activity would be, it would be creating this nav bar right here where there's an outer div that wraps around everything called nav bar. And then inside you have title. And then the other div is for the nav buttons, where inside you will have these link tags, which will link to different files within your repository. So this one will be for add trip, and this one will be for add activity.html. So next we'll be going into CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So a quick introduction to what CSS might be is HTML and CSS would be this panda with the lollipop. But if you only have HTML, you would just have the lollipop. So the CSS is adding the styling on the website with your main elements, for example, being the lollipop, or more applicable to us, it would just be links on our web page. Like before, without the styling, this would just be hack polls, add poll, manage poll, just links stacked on top. But with the CSS, you can actually make it look like this, like an actual navigation bar. So here's external CSS, and this is usually how we do it by connecting a external style sheet, which is the second file on the bottom with your CSS, and then you connect it to your HTML file on the top. And the important line of code is the link tag, where the relation is a style sheet, and the reference is to style CSS, which is the name of the CSS file. And then here you can see how the H2 element is being used to put the color red and to align the text to the center. And another part of CSS is selectors, which will be how you attribute different styling to specific elements on your HTML. So here you can see the class is top div for the first div, and then the second class for the second div is bottom div. And these are the selectors, and this is the name for what our selectors will be calling to put different background colors. So here you can see CSS goes from top down, from least specific to most specific. So first you start with the div, which will make the background light green. So div will call all the div elements. But for the second line of CSS, it calls the class bottom div, which is more specific than just calling the general div element. And this will make it light blue. So here you can see that the bottom div is light blue, but the top div is still light green. This is because calling the class is more specific than calling the div, so it being light blue will override the CSS for it being light green. So more about selectors, what is a class and ID? So if we want to just select one specific element with the div tag and only style that tag, we'd have to use special selectors for it. So class can be put onto multiple elements, but an ID can only be associated with one element. An ID is more specific than class, so ID would override class, and then class would override element in that order. So this is an example of class versus ID. You can see that the outer wrapping div has an ID of navbar, but the inner divs have a class of nav buttons because you have two of them, and you want to apply the bold font to all of the nav buttons at once. So you use the class selector. So another important part of CSS is flexbox, which is a way to arrange elements on your HTML and give it a specific behavior. So here we're calling the trips container class and adding display flex, justify content center, and align item center. And then we're going to apply a styling to the elements within the container, which is the trip blocks. And then we're doing flex equals 1. So display flex and flex equals 1 works together to create this specific behavior of making the trips and activity box in the example above to be right beside each other. So this shows an example of flexbox usage. So this is just a reference for flexbox. You guys can refer back to this when you guys are doing flexbox or CSS in the following activities. So the second activity will be implementing Flexbox into the home page. So before, after activity 1, you would have seen the image on the left with just links. But with CSS, we can get to the result on the right, which shows a navigation bar with orange styling, and the buttons are styled and it's arranged in the way that we want. So this is the activity 2 to style the nav bar, and then you guys can try that. So now we're going to show the solutions for the second activity. So here we have our comments for the directions for the CSS, and then each line correlates to its line in CSS. So I'll just point out some examples. So to turn the navbar into flex container, you do display flex. And then to arrange it in the way that we want, for example, to align the items evenly vertically across the navbar, we would do align item center, and aligning it evenly horizontally would be justify content with a space between value. So for the nav buttons, we have a more general CSS that's not really associated with Flexbox, but we have a padding, which makes the buttons fatter. We have a border to specify that it's 1 pixel wide with a solid white color. And then we're customizing the border radius, the color, the font size, and to make the text decoration disappear, which is the purple line underneath links that you often see. So you get rid of that using text decoration none. So some references or activities for to just practice Flexbox and CSS. There is Coding Fantasy and Flexbox Froggy. So you guys can try that out to practice your CSS skills. So next, we'll be introducing JavaScript.
Hi everyone! I'll be going over some basics of JavaScript that will be useful for our project. So first of all, we're going to start with JavaScript objects. Objects are a way to organize and group data inside of JavaScript. So here we have an example of an object, and we'll go over all of the basics of using and accessing properties within an object. So first, you'll notice that we defined the object using the constant keyword. So here we're defining the constant organization object, and it holds properties such as name, age, and a method, hack school. You'll notice that these properties are held within brackets, and the keyword const or constant means that the reference to the object cannot be reassigned, but the properties within the object can be modified. This means that we can't reassign organization to a different value, for example, 6, but we can modify the things that are inside the organization object. So you'll notice that the properties inside the organization object are stored as key value pairs. So for example, in the first property, we have the key name and we have the value ACMUCSD. This means that we're storing the name of the organization, which is ACMUCSD, and you'll see something similar for the age as well. You'll also notice that we're storing a method or a function inside of this object. So a method is a function within an object, and you'll see here that we've defined a method, hackschool, that prints out JavaScript workshop to the console whenever we call it. So hack school is an arrow function, which we'll go over later, that when called logs JavaScript workshop to the console, and it demonstrates that objects in JavaScript can also contain functions. This is an example of how to access properties inside of an object. So here we're defining a constant myname, and we're assigning it to the value of the name property from the organization object, which in this case is ACMUCSD. You'll notice here that the dot notation is used to access the name property, and when we print this out to the console, we'll get ACMUCSD. Here, with the constant org name, we're attempting to access a property of the organization object using bracket notation, which is another valid way of accessing properties inside JavaScript. However, name is not a variable in this context, but a string. So although it looks like the name, age, and hack school property keys are just placed there in plain text, they're actually stored as strings. So if we want to actually refer to the ACM UCSD property, we actually have to put name within double quotes to make it a string. So currently this org name line will probably cause an error because name is not defined as a variable. You can also see here that we're able to call the methods that are inside of an object. So here we're calling the hack school method of the organization object. And when this method is executed, it will print JavaScript workshop to the console. And by using the parentheses in front after hack school, this indicates that we're calling the function and running it. This is an example of modifying objects. So as we mentioned earlier, objects constants are not reassignable, but we're able to modify the properties within these objects. So by accessing a property of the object, we're able to modify it. So you can see here that we're using a variable name in place of the actual name of the property. So here we've defined a constant property name and we're assigning it to the value hosts. And then when we console log the person's property name, we're actually replacing the variable property name with its value hosts. And then when we look up at the Haxel object's property of hosts, we'll see the array value that it holds with all of these names. So when we print this out to the console, it'll print out everyone's names. And there you'll see that we can access these variables both using dot notation like we mentioned earlier up there with hackschool.year, or you can access it using bracket notation. So down below person, and then in this case property name is hosts. And you can see that we can change these values. So you'll see that, for example, with hackschool.year, we're actually changing it to reflect the current year. So first we'll access the property with hackschool.year, and then we'll change it to a different value of 2024. And similarly, we can do the same for any other value. So you'll see it here, an example of dot notation and an example of bracket notation. So we mentioned earlier that we can use arrow functions as a way to simplify writing functions to put them as methods inside of our objects. So arrow functions are ways to simplify writing functions that allow us to write shorter functions. So you see here on top that we have an example of a regular function where we define its name, add nums, its parameters num1 and num2, and what we want to do inside the function, which is return num1 plus num2. You'll see here that in our arrow function, we've simplified this down into one line. So we've defined the function using let, although generally in practice you use const. We have the name of the function, which is add nums. We have an equal sign, and then we have the parameters inside parentheses, so num1 and num2. And then we have an arrow symbol that points toward what we want to do with these parameters. So you see here that we want to return num1 plus num2. So both of these are valid ways to write functions inside of JavaScript. It really depends on your own personal style and kind of what you're looking to save space in. So here's activity number 3. I'll give you guys some time to work on it. Just pause the video and then move forward when you're ready. So this is some of the instructions for building the activity. And we'll move on now to asynchronous code. So asynchronous code is a really important concept. It allows us to run other tasks while waiting for other ones to finish, which improves performance. So you can see in the graphic that we want to make multiple requests at once without waiting for the response from each one. So you'll see in the synchronous code that when I first make request number 1, I have to wait for a response before I can make the second request, request number 2. Now you can imagine if request number 1 takes a really long time to respond, such as 5 minutes, we're going to be waiting for a really long time before we can make a request number 2. In asynchronous code, we can actually call both of these requests and wait for the responses individually without having to wait for one response to come in before we call the next request. So you'll see that for the asynchronous code, we're able to make request number 1 and request number 2, and then wait for the responses of both of those requests without backlogging the other requests from running. So another feature of JavaScript is known as callbacks. So callbacks are functions passed as arguments to other functions. So for example, let's say you want to write a greet function where you want to call a callMe function inside of the greet function. You can pass the callMe function as a callback to greet so that greet can perform the callMe function within greet. So you'll see here that in the argument list of greet, we have name and callback. And we also define our callback function callMe separately. So then when we actually call greet, we can pass in our callback function, call me, and then inside of the greet function, we call our callback function. And since we've passed in call me, we're passing in the function of call me. So when we run callback, it'll actually run the call me function and print call me back to the console. So this is a good way of making your code more generalized. For example, if I wanted to personalize a greeting message inside a function, for example, me call, then we could pass both of these to greet and they would still have the same effect. So for example, let's say we write a function called me call, and inside we want to print out back me call, right? So instead of having to write two separate greet functions, we can actually pass in me call to the greet callback parameter, and when we run callback, it'll actually run back me call. So that saves us a lot of time and effort as well as makes your code more readable. Another aspect of JavaScript is promises. So promises are objects that wait for another process to resolve before acting on the results of the promise function. So let's say, for example, that you promise to your mom that you're going to clean your room, right? She says, if you don't clean your room, I'll actually make you do the laundry instead. So there's two outcomes in this scenario, right? Either we fulfill the promise and we clean the room, or we don't fulfill the promise. And what happens if we fulfill the promise? Then we're allowed to go outside and play. And if we don't fulfill the promise, then we actually have to go and do the laundry. So the idea of a promise here is that depending on whether or not a request is fulfilled, we have two separate outcomes that we can go with depending on the result of the first promise object. So promises have two main methods, then and catch. So the main way we can process the two outcomes of a promise object are using then catch methods. If we have a successful result, we use a then method to perform a certain action, and then we use a catch for a failed result. So for example, in the previous example, if we wrote a promise function for cleaning your room, then inside the then block, we would write a function that lets you go outside and play, and in the catch block, we could write a function that makes you do laundry, right? So that handles these things. So you'll see here on the right that we have an example of a commonly used promise object. You'll see that first we want to call some sort of request, and depending on a response, if we have a successful result, then we want to do something with this response, and otherwise, we actually want to reject the response and print out an error. Um, Async and await functions are used with promise objects. So async functions are ways to return a promise, and await is a keyword used inside asynchronous functions that lets you wait until the promise is settled or resolved. So in this piece of code on the right, we want to define a promise function, promise object. So here we say that we want to wait for 4,000 milliseconds before we resolve with the message promise resolve. So here we define our asynchronous function async func, and then we let the result await promise. This means that our result is going to wait for the result of the promise object that we defined earlier. So once the time is up, it'll come up with a specific result, and then we can print out this result and then print out hello. So here we're awaiting the promise inside of the asynchronous function. So here's our fourth activity. We're going to use an asynchronous function to simulate real-time votes with a delay, one vote at a time. So how are we going to do this? We're going to be using a promise object. So a promise is a placeholder for something that will finish later, like an API call or a timer. We'll use a wait inside of the asynchronous function to pause and wait for it to finish, and we mark the function as asynchronous to allow that pause. So here's a couple instructions for doing this code. I'll give you guys some time, just pause the video, and then we'll come back to it. So thank you for attending our workshop. Here's some documentation if you're interested in looking further into the topics that we covered today. Here's some links about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And as always, we have our feedback form here. You're always welcome to give us and our team more feedback about our workshops to make sure we're running the best possible workshops for you. And unfortunately, Hack School applications are now closed, but be sure to follow along in any of our following recordings and attend if you were accepted in Hack School. Thank you so much.